First, I'd like to congratulate Stefano and all of his colleagues at the OECD for a really in-depth and rigorous and great look at what are the myths and realities of automation and the workforce transitions. We came out with a report at the McKinsey Global Institute yesterday, and our overall conclusions about the impact of automation and the fears that jobs are disappearing are very much in line with what we said, so I won't go over that now. But I think that there are, just 5 quick points I would make in reaction to what I just saw. First is that even as we look at the innovation accelerating and advances in machine learning and AI, what's not changing is adoption rates. So we've done a lot of looking at how fast are companies actually diffusing and adopting these new innovations, and there's no evidence that there's been an acceleration in how fast it's percolating through the workforce yet. Now that could change if we continue to get very rapid advances in machine vision, language processing, etc. Maybe it will change going forward, but at least to date, we see companies, if anything, are too slow because it's a huge CapEx investment. It's a huge organizational investment for them to adopt this because it's not just applying technology to what you do today. The success comes from re-envisioning your operations and redesigning them. So this is like a major transformation project. And ironically, it seems that the rapid advances in technology, if anything, may be slowing down adoption. Because I hear over and over companies saying, but should I make this multi-million-dollar investment today because in a year the technology is going to be cheaper and it's going to be better, so maybe we should just wait. And it's sort of a nice excuse for the procrastinator in all of us. The second point that I would underscore is this notion that jobs will change, that there are very few occupations that can be fully automated. But our research, using very much the same methodology, where we start with granular definition of tasks and what are the capabilities involved in each task and then roll that up into occupations, is that 60% of occupations have at least 30% of the tasks that could be automated by 2030. So this means that going forward, all of our jobs are going to shift a bit. So there's going to be, in general, our research, I think, is very consistent with what you found is what machines are really good at is activities that happen, manual activities in a predictable environment, not an unpredictable environment, but in a predictable, say, fast food chefs, a cashier, an assembly line worker. Machines are also very good at collecting and processing data. So there's a whole armies of back office, financial analysts, accountants, etc., where that will be done increasingly by machines. But what people are good at is interactive skills. Now this is a big challenge. I know that the focus of this conference is very much on workforce skills and education, because what we focus on increasingly in education is STEM skills. And these are important, and yes, there will be the builders and maintainers of robots, but increasingly what humans do better is the social and emotional interactions, managing others, working with others, caring for old people, etc. So these are the skills that are increasingly going to be in demand, and yet they're exactly the skills that we don't teach. Third point I'd make is that the jobs gauge. So in our report, we don't look only at the impact of automation, but we model out what could labor demand look like in different countries around the world in the years to 2030, because we want to get a sense of which occupations will grow even while we know which ones will decline. And in here, societal choices are going to play a really big role. We model just a trend line, sort of business as usual, employment growth, and you get growth in lots of different occupations. But then we model a series of choices. So if, for instance, a country like the United States decided to invest in its crumbling infrastructure, so we know that we've underinvested for many decades, and if we made that choice, it would not only have other positive economic effects on the overall economy and productivity, but it would create a lot of jobs. Similarly, energy transitions, renewable energy and energy efficiency. Affordable housing, huge issue here in California. So we look at these different choices, and there are many ways in which countries that choose to make job creation a priority could actually invest in these. And this is going to be actually very important, particularly for a country like the US. That said, we do see a huge shift for millions of people. So globally, 75 to 375 million people may need to completely shift occupational groupings. That means you're going from being an assembly line worker to being a welder, or you're going from being a cashier to a medical tech. So you're going to need training, and you're going to need training in the middle of your life and career when you may have children, mortgages, financial obligations. So going back to school for 2 years or 4 years is more or less out of the question. So it's going to be a big challenge. In advanced economies, for instance, in the US, it could be, depending on how fast automation is adopted, anywhere between 15 and 32% of the workforce could end up needing to mid-career shift occupations. So this mantra of lifelong learning truly needs to become a reality. And for that, we're going to need an institutional shift. What the institutions we have in place today really are not designed to deal with this, especially at scale. And I don't think any country in the world has cracked this one. I think that last night, Ken Goldberg gave a great example of the US high school movement, that when we've had these massive employment transitions in the past, we've had an equally massive institutional shift. So going from hardly anyone attending or finishing secondary school to the majority of people. So we'll need something like that. Similarly, I realize that that's going to be a discussion this afternoon and going into tomorrow. But again, I would just congratulate Stefano and his colleagues on a really rich and insightful study.
Before I turn to my colleagues for some comments, I want to indulge myself on making 3 remarks as feedback on this as well. One of the questions, because the variation in the distribution of tasks and jobs across country is important. It obviously raises the question of why. And equally important, what would have been choices that might have been made in different places that would change the character of what that job or task distribution is. The way in which you make an NC machine tool or use it in the 1980s in Germany, Japan, and in the United States were radically different. And they implied different kinds of skills, different kinds of tasks, and the like. And that leads into something very clearly that, and that of course affects the vulnerability of different kinds of workers, leads to something that Hannah Shapiro would point you always make to me, which I'm sure you'll make again, which is much of this depends on the underlying organization of work, how people understand how to organize and use their workforces, which is partly aimed at where their business opportunities are, but also how they achieve them. So we shouldn't take any of these outcomes that we're seeing as indubitable, inevitable sets of results that we now want to analyze, but we need to go beneath them so we can understand the choices going forward. The second point, and I really always respond to this, which is I think that when we say what are human skills, we understate the question. It's not, I think, just emotional social skills. An enormous part of this is the ability to identify in a situation what we think the problem we're trying to solve actually is. Again, I come back in game theory because many of my colleagues do game theory. In fact, I always am struck by the fact of if I'm sitting in the middle of a road and a car's coming at me, the question I really want to answer is this guy playing chicken or is this some other kind of cooperative game? Exactly what my next move is depends on my judgment about what that game is. So that in fact the ability to identify and analyze situations and locate how to use these intelligent tools in ways that in fact they can be made productive is, I think, absolutely critical and is not easily transferred in any kind of way to some set of algorithmic solutions. And that leads, of course, to the last point, which is an enormous amount of how work is organized, how we identify problems depends on user interfaces. What kinds of links do we build so that, in fact, we can use these tools? In fact, the kinds of tools we build partly depends on the skills of workforces, but the kinds of tools we build also shapes the kinds of skills that are required. Our classic example, which we repeat ad nauseum, is that the secretarial pool, the work in the secretarial pool was destroyed by all of our friends at Microsoft and others who created Microsoft Office as an interface, as a user tool. It transformed the character of work. So we need to think about what are those alternative trajectories, what are the skills that are both required if we change the user interfaces, and what are the skills that, in fact, we're responding to. Are we building notions about what's possible in the past rather than out of what's the future? With that, let me turn to my colleagues. Maybe we start with Giovanni. Let's try and keep each remark to 10 minutes or so. Giovanni, Brad, and then Laura, if you could.
Here?
Yeah.
There we go. Well, this meeting is really timely because I think that we are at a true bifurcation. John was emphasizing the fact that we are in this position in history where we can affect the choice of the overall trajectory that the economy and society can take. I can envisage two extreme scenarios. One is what I call the Blade Runner scenario. Remember the film, number one, in which you've got a sort of medieval techno-feudalism with an elite that master the technology and a huge proletariat, which, I mean, by all statistics in a Blade Runner world would be classified as employed, but employed in a medieval way. At the opposite extreme, there is what they call the Keynes scenario, with the little book, What Are We Going to Leave to Our Grandchildren? Saying, finally, technology will get rid of all the boring jobs. We will be working 2 days per week, 1 day per week, and we spend the rest of the time with music, poetry, whatever. I think this is the time in which we can affect the choice between the two, and I'm quite pessimistic on the trends that seem to head more toward the Blade Runner than the other one. In fact, I mean, we are at the very beginning, so it is important to see what are the patterns that are already occurring. And in that, I mean, I've been 90% preempted by Stefano, so I'll be extremely quick. How do I move this? Well, Stefano has gone through that, so I'll be extremely quick. You have deindustrialization in the West. You've got stagnant wages and a widening product. These are US data. Sorry, these are 36 countries from OECD countries. And as you can see, since the 90s, you have a widening wedge between labor productivity and wage growth. And even the wage growth, again, Stefan has already talked about it, has concerned the top quintile of the distribution, while at the bottom quintile of the distribution, you had a fall in real wages since 1973. And this has got worsened with the crisis. With the crisis, you had an overall drop with only the top 2 decile experiencing some growth in real wages. Declining manufacturing share in all Western countries. Decline in the share of labor compensation in income. That is a reverse of the trend that you had in secular trend that showed since the Industrial Revolution, first a fall and then a slow growth of the share of wages into the GDP. You have a decline that is very different across country. It's dramatic in the US, but begins in recent times also in European countries. Decline in medium income. A dramatic surge in profits. And if you break up the surge in profit, within that, the massive increases in financial profit associated with financialization of the economy. Again, a different rate in different countries, but this is a common pattern in the West. Declining labor force unionization rate. Laura was mentioning it, and with effects on hourly pay. I mean, the hourly pay is dramatically affected by the degree of unionization. So the things that we were seeing before on the dynamics of wages, one of the institutional causes has got to be found there, well independently from technological causes. And Stefano was mentioning it already too. You have a declining job creation rate. I mean, with all the fuss that we hear about the world is is not solid any longer, is melting like snow, people move here and there. In fact, you have got a fall in both job creation and job destruction. And you have a longer and longer time lapse between the trough of a recession and when employment starts recovering. Polarization. Stefano and Maria Grazia and all the OECD have been emphasizing that, and I don't need to go back to that. More. Yeah. Well, how these trends are going to be affected by the intelligent automation that we are going to face? Well, the two possibly complementary, but I think relatively ugly scenario, in my view, are one, Taylorism plus robotics. That is the Foxconn model, in which you have, working conditions that are, in comparison, the Dickensian industrial Dickensian working condition in London was the Club Méditerranée, and this associated with the total control of the workforce and with a massive use of automation of robots. The other extreme is the sort of Uber, Foodora, Deliveroo system. Here we have got to discuss whether this is gig economy or it is freelance. My impression is that it's much more like a high-tech putting out system that occurred before the mechanization of production, with essentially a narrative, a mythology of your own boss. In fact, I mean, unlike the old putting out system, you have people controlling themselves and being controlled remotely by an algorithm. And this, of course, interacts with income distribution, because this is associated with very low pay. What to do? In any case, one has to be also on the production side. See the German program, Industry 4.0, because if you're not on the production side, you also import unemployment. You not only displace your own skilled worker, but you're not partly compensating by making the robots, so you also import unemployment. You need to prevent an industrialization. And to do that, you need major, I think, mission-oriented programs. And finally, we have got to seriously talk about income and working hour redistribution. This brings us to a macro subject that maybe we'll talk about later, but we cannot avoid talking about who pays taxes. Yeah. How do we make the firms in the forefront of the Industrial Revolution pay taxes? Because this is necessary for all the program of reskilling, welfare, universal health coverage, etc. Stop here.
You see. I'm very happy to be here, if only because this means I get to spend 2 days in which Washington, D.C. does not get to live rent-free inside my brain 24/7. And that is a blessing in this particular day and age. Instead, we get to think of longer-term and, we all hope, much more important issues. I find myself wanting to make 3 big points. The first about the value of the human. The second about the inadequacy of our social scientific framing of the problem. And the third about our need for a dominant organizing metaphor to guide our thought. So let's start with the fact that humans are not going to be, and not in any danger of being replaced anytime soon. And let me grab the ideas of quantum computing expert Scott Aronson, who wrote a very nice little book called Quantum Computing Since Democritus. And at one point in it, he's talking about the human brain. And as we all know, the human brain is a supercomputer that fits inside half a shoebox and draws only 50 watts of power. Contrast this with Bitcoin mining, which is now consuming more electricity than Ireland for no useful social purpose whatsoever. If we wanted to program up something of such complexity and power of a human brain, with, say, 1 page of code for each neuron, then I believe the program would need to be the size of the Earth. And the code in that program would have been tuned by 1 billion years of evolutionary pressure to make it very good at the core competencies of the gatherer-hunter traditional tasks of the human brain. Face recognition, people mood recognition, maintaining a remarkable ability to recognize objects and figure out which is likely to be poisonous and which is not. And as much as we admire the programmers of our Googles and our engineering schools, no one of them yet living is going to come anywhere close to producing the true Turing-class AI, the kind of thing that requires that sort of program. Except, of course, for the half of them who are female and can grow one in their wombs in 9 months. Humans are not going to be replaced anytime soon. Now, we do not see this because one of the biases in our gatherer-hunter toolkit is to overestimate the intelligence of whatever we're dealing with. That after all, thinking that the deer you're hunting is smarter than it is probably isn't going to hurt you. Thinking that something you're dealing with is a lot dumber than it is may well hurt you. Thus, for example, we have human beings who are willing to ascribe very human characteristics to something, say, like the thunder. It's a large, red-haired guy with serious anger management issues, played by Chris Hemsworth, who has an incredibly destructive hammer you do not want to get in the way of. And in some way, this story exists and propagates because you don't want to be standing outside on a hilltop when the thunderstorm comes, and figuring out when Thor is around and is feeling his anger management issues, it's a good time to hide in a low place. Those of our ancestors who did that survived. Those of our potential ancestors who didn't do that didn't survive. And now we're here. Thus, we are very prone to deal with whatever we're dealing with as if it were human class, even if it's just a semi-sophisticated voice interface with a database for a database search. And the difference between a voice interface to database search that we can treat as human for all practical purposes in our daily operations, as long as we don't demand that it actually venture outside its particular range of expertise, and true AI, that difference is absolutely massive. So humans are going to be around and are going to be doing lots of valuable things for a long, long time to come. However, tasks vanish. Back in the 13th century at Oxford, one important task to perform and the skill to learn was the ability to write a fine chancery hand so you could prepare your own documents. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to have had enough penmanship to be able to actually approach a fine chancery hand anymore. But it was a very important skill and one that was hard to learn, and thus the source of a very good living if you were a 13th century lawyer or clerk. So tasks are going to vanish, and the occupations for which those tasks are parts are certainly going to change, and change in all kinds of ways, but ways that are only very tenuously connected to what they actually require in terms of education, learning, difficulty, whatever. And the social valence of occupations change as well. In the late 19th century, a secretary was still an important job. It was still primarily the person who kept track of your secret affairs for someone who was a relatively skilled and sophisticated and well-educated human. Your special assistant, say. Your trusted special assistant. But then comes the feminization of office work, and all of a sudden, secretary loses status and loses income at a mammoth rate. Cashier. Cashier was once the only person in the shop you trust to handle the money. Right? That's a very important job. You still see this in old banks, which have office managers called chief cashiers. Then came the cash register. And lo and behold, the thing gets feminized, and its salary and its status collapse as well. So humans are going to be valuable. How much sociologically we value what those humans do, that's a different question. And here, I think our traditional framing is putting us wrong. That if you had to ask what the traditional framing were, it's that they're unskilled workers who are kind of not interesting because they're just raw labor, they don't have human capital. And then there are semi-skilled workers who have about half a brain full of human capital, and so they can do things that require half a brain full of skill, and they have intermediate wages and so forth. And then there are people who come to things in the Seaborg room, to conferences. And our brains are totally full of human capital. And so we can do a lot of valuable things because we have formal education plus substantial practice and experience in the cognitively difficult things. Now, if we went over to the engineering department, and if we asked, what is cognitively difficult and what isn't, we might get some very, very different answers, right? That my daughter next week is going to take her final exam in differential equations, where she has learned by 100 hours over a semester or so to identify about 40 different patterns of differential equations and memorize what the patterns of solutions are, and so then, given the variables in the problem, figure out where those variables go in the solution and then evaluate the thing. That's a very cognitively intense and difficult problem. That's totally solved over in engineering. That's just fairly simple pattern recognition with a few stuff. And indeed, http:// mustn't forget the S these days, / wolframalpha.com will do it for you, and will do it better, without any of those nasty mistakes like I made when I was actually trying to solve a differential equation last week. On the other hand, picking up irregularly shaped objects and packing them into a shipping container, something that's within the billion-year of evolution-tuned hunter-gatherer toolkit, that's a hard AI problem, a genuinely hard AI problem, an unsolved one. But it's within the competence of practically every East African plains ape. And so, as a result, it's unskilled. So I'd say unskilled jobs are those that are within the core hunter-gatherer toolkit of the human brain. Semi-skilled jobs are jobs that are unskilled, but in which on-the-job experience and apprenticeship is sufficiently important that you have some market power and rent-sharing ability, which matters because you have to be located in a sector where there are rents to share in order for a job to be semi-skilled. High-skilled jobs, formal education plus practice in occupation not in the standard hunter-gatherer toolkit, with high scarcity value because it is a thing that's rather difficult for East African plains apes to learn, but it may or may not be easily computerizable and automatable. And then there are the rent extractors. And from this perspective, what's currently happening is it's not so much a skill versus unskill thing. It's that we're managing to move massive amounts of computer power into the semi-skilled and to a large chunk of the high-skilled occupations, while money flows to the rent extractors, and the semi-skilled and others get pushed into the unskilled worker pool, boosting supply. That's a serious income distribution problem. And then my last point, unconnected, that we really need a metaphor to think about this. That back in the agriculture craft age, we thought of the typical job as small-scale production and talked about how the division of labor was important and the division of labor depended on the extent of the market. And we had Smithian economics. During the age of the Industrial Revolution, the typical job was thought of as the assembly line worker, and we had Fordist value chains, and a whole bunch of economic and sociological problems were opened up by that, because the idea was to have highly productive value chains relying on technology and power, and to fit workers into that. We need a similar dominant metaphor for thinking about what the typical job of the future is going to be. Let me suggest one, that it really depends on whether we have a social democratic society or a plutocratic society. If we have a plutocratic society, then the ways humans create value will be by satisfying whatever the Joneses of the rich have to be, because the rich have the money, and you have to satisfy them. And then the overwhelming mass of people are out of luck, are hosed. In a social democratic society, everyone needs a life coach, a personal shopper, a personal trainer, a psychotherapist, an entertainment coordinator, and a news summarizer. And you always want to bounce your ideas off of a human being. Maybe you can watch Oprah on the TV, but that's not a great substitute for a good many people. Kind of take seriously the helping and social interaction and kind of human community bonds reinforcement professions. And 6 for half an hour a day. We have 3 hours of work today. We've employed half the labor force on a 6-hour day. Just by keeping us all properly coached. There's going to be no problem in finding jobs for human beings. The question will be, will those jobs be jobs working for people who have the income to make them a middle-class jobs? Thank you.